Hi, I'm Ezza, aka EvilCleverDog, and in this video I'm going to show you how to create an awesome leather texture on foam armour. I've done a lot of leather texturing on foam for various different projects, including my Cassandra cosplay that you can see here, and it's a technique I really enjoy doing. Aside from the belts and straps, all the leather on this armour, including the trebuchets and the quiver on the back, is made from foam. First, I'm going to show you an easy and cheap method for creating a base leather texture on flat pieces of foam. Then later in the video I'm going to go into different techniques, tools and materials that you can use to create different levels of leather effect and weathering, and finally I'll show you my process behind painting that awesome leather effect. For this tutorial I'm using an offcut of 5mm foam. Tear off a big piece of tin foil and crumple it up. Carefully unfold it to create a large sheet of textured foil. Place the foil sheet over your foam on the ironing board and press a hot iron into it. When you remove the foil, it will leave behind a subtle leather-like texture. Repeat this process over the entire sheet. This is a great and cost-effective technique for creating a subtle leather look, or a base to work onto further, as well as covering large areas of foam in the texture quickly. If I want to create a heavier texture, I can add more to the leather effect I've already created. I do this by crumpling up more foil, but leaving it as a little ball of foil this time. Using a heat gun, I heat up areas of the foam sheet and press the crumpled foil into it. This leaves behind smaller patches of deeper imprinted texture. I sometimes twist or drag the foil to create a more organic and heavier weathered look. It's great for creating variation in the depth of the texture you've created, which replicates the natural randomness of organic materials. Bear in mind that heat can undo your previous texture work, so I use the heat gun sparingly and in quick blasts, and apply the foil as quickly as I can. So that's how you can make a really cool leather texture with literally just some tin foil and something to apply heat with. It's a really quick and easy technique for getting a really effective texture that's going to be utilised in a lot of different costumes and prop pieces. So originally I was going to just paint this sheet as it is, but I actually think it would be better to make something, because then you'll be able to see how the leather effect looks on like a finished prop or costume piece. So I think I'm going to take this foam sheet I've made and I'm going to quickly pattern maybe like a little pauldron or something, just to show you guys how it then looks as a finished product. I'm using a duct tape mannequin of myself to pattern the pauldron on. First, I bulk up the shoulder area a little to get a more rounded shape for the top half of the pauldron. I then add a layer of cling film and cover it in masking tape to create a surface which I can then sketch my pattern onto. This video is focusing on how to create the leather texture, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about what I'm doing here, but I can definitely cover armour patterning in another video. If that's something you'd like to see, let me know in a comment down below. For this pauldron, I am designing on the fly to make something that will showcase the leather effect well. Basically going with the rough concept of a heavily weathered piece of armour that, say, a rogue or archer type character might wear. So I'm creating a simple layered pauldron with a larger rounded piece on top, and a fitted piece for my upper arm to go underneath that. I also want to show the contrast between leather and another texture, so I add a border that will be metal with rivets, and some small strips of metal that will break up both the texture and colours of the leather. When I'm happy with the pattern, I remove the pieces from the mannequin and cut them out. I also cut out the registration marks, and darts where the pieces naturally want to curve. I then transfer my pattern pieces to the textured foam I made earlier. I draft 2 pieces of foam for each pattern piece, and flip the pattern to the opposite side to create the second pieces. This is so each piece will be symmetrical. I cut these out with a scalpel, apply contact adhesive to both sides of the seams and the darts, and then use the registration marks as a guide to stick them all together. I then add an extra little neck guard piece and cut the metal strips from 2mm foam. I also created the layered area on the top pauldron piece from 5mm foam using the same method as before. Before I add the metal borders, I add in some more leather texture to certain areas. I press foil into the darts and seam lines in particular to further disguise them. Now that I've squashed and flattened out my pauldron a little by adding more texture to it, I use my heat gun to reshape it. To do this, I flip both pieces onto the back so that the heat won't erase my leather texture. Now I cut out the metal border from 2mm foam and glue it to both pauldron pieces. Then I sand down the edges of both pauldron pieces. With the border added, I can start adding more weathering to the overall pauldron. When thinking about how much you're going to weather your costume or prop, consider the history of the piece, what kind of character it belongs to, what kind of life they live, and adventures they go on. For the sake of this tutorial and showcasing these techniques better, I decided to make my pauldron fairly weathered. So I'm imagining that, much like Kassadra over here, this pauldron belongs to someone who gets into a lot of scrapes and has owned their armour for a long time. And that's going to be reflected in how weathered the armour is. I start by adding a few nicks and cuts with my scalpel where blades may have caught the edges of the pauldron in battle. I then use my Dremel to sand into these cuts and deepen them. I also love using the Dremel to create the cuts and gouges in the leather, as it makes it look more torn and worn down in the way that leather would, in contrast to metal where the cuts would leave sharper edges behind. I add a couple of particularly deep gouges on the upper pauldron piece where a blade strike would get caught and be forced to glance off the armour. I then keep using my Dremel to add additional areas of leather texture. I hold my sanding drum flat to the foam and tap it into the foam at different angles to create heavier mottled patches. This again randomizes the texture, making it appear more worn in some areas. Another way to add additional, even heavier worn texture to leather armour is using a wood burner tool. Much like the Dremel, this can be used to further deepen the gouges and cuts on the armour, but I also sometimes use it to create other patches of different texture on the leather effect, when I want the leather to look really old and worn. Like with the Dremel, I lightly tap the wood burner into the foam at different angles to create a randomly mottled texture. Don't be afraid to go extreme. When it comes to foam crafting, heavier textures can read better on camera and provide areas that will naturally pop when you come to paint them later. Now I just want to say that you don't have to use all of these techniques on the same piece. It depends entirely on how weathered you want your armour to look and also how much you're able to spend on different tools and materials. You can create an awesome leather effect with just the tinfoil technique I showcased earlier, but you might want to consider buying a Dremel or a wood burner when you can invest more in your costume and prop making endeavours. Another detail I'm adding to the pauldron is holes around the layered area on the upper piece of the pauldron, using the drill bit on my Dremel. Later on, I'm going to thread leather cord through this for a nice additional touch to this armour piece. I apply a little flexible filler to the seam lines just to make sure they're disguised. I use googly eyes to make the rivets on the metal border. Pro tip, googly eyes make excellent cheap rivets for foam armour. But you always want to add them after you've done any of your heat shaping and texturing because the heat can melt the googly eyes. Now the build is finished, I use Hexflex to prime the foam for painting. Hexflex is a water-based primer that stays slightly flexible when it's dry, so it's perfect for priming armour pieces like this. I apply 3 or 4 coats to get a good coverage. When that's dry, I can take a proper look at how this pauldron is looking so far before I paint it. There's some really nice varied texture work here that's really going to pop when I start painting this piece. Now it's time to talk about painting a leather effect piece. For this pauldron, I'm starting with a base in burnt umber. To paint leather, I put down a brown base, then layer up multiple layers in different tones of brown to create the mottled look of leather. You can use different tones of brown as the base to create a different overall tone in the leather. Burnt umber will create a medium tone for the purposes of this tutorial, but you could also start with a raw umber for darker leather or raw sienna for a lighter one, for example. After I've painted the brown base, I mix black and silver to create the base for the metal areas. I then dry brush over the metal areas just in a higher pigmented silver to give it a layered look of brushed metal. At this stage, I seal my paint job so far with spray varnish so that I can do additional layers without scrubbing off the paint I've already put down. Next, I do a black wash over the entire pauldron, both the leather and metal areas. With a lot of water on my brush, I paint black into all the crevices, lines, and receded areas. I then use kitchen towel to wipe most of the paint away, leaving a weathered look behind and more black paint left in the areas that would be the darkest and most recessed. I touch up a few areas such as around the rivets with a smaller brush. Now I get into creating some different tones in the leather. Starting with raw sienna, which is a lighter brown tone, I apply the paint with a dry brush technique. Using a rough bristled brush with no water on it, I lightly dust the paint onto the foam. This is where the heavy texture work I did earlier begins to really shine. The paint adheres more to the raised areas, highlighting the texture that's already there and creating natural definition between these patches of texture like you would get on real leather. I apply the paint heavier in some areas than others. As I continue to build up different brown tones, this adds to the illusion of this being a natural material. Next, I repeat the same process in burnt sienna, a very reddish brown. Like with the raw sienna, I dust this tone on, adding more dimension and tonal differences into my leather armour. I then apply some buff titanium, a light, almost off-white brown, much more sparingly. This colour can overpower, so I wipe some of it away if I feel like it looks too extreme. It's all about creating a balance between the different brown tones. This buff titanium is great for minimal highlighting, so I try to limit how much of it I use. Finally, I do two more dry brushing layers, one with the raw sienna and one with the burnt umber, the two more neutral tones, to knock back the two more extreme tones and unify the piece. With the leather done, I dry brush a little more silver onto the metal borders to bring back some of the sheen that got knocked back with the black wash and highlight the edges. For a final touch, I add some raw sienna into some of the most recessed areas of the metal, such as around the rivets and in gouges, to create a very light rust effect, since this armour is meant to be pretty old and worn. I then spray seal both pauldron pieces. Now that I'm done painting the armour, I add the leather cord. This is going to look like it's holding the extra padded layer of leather onto the top of the pauldron. I thread the cord through, secure it with a knot behind the first hole, and then continue to thread it through each hole around the pauldron. I then trim it down and secure it with another knot. Adding practical or decorative leather cord to leather armour is another great way to add some depth and realism to it. I then use some leather straps and velcro I already have to make some simple attachments for the pauldron, one around my upper arm and one to go around my torso. I love how the leather cord looks with the armour, but considering how weathered the rest of this armour is, the cord and the straps would look out of place if I left them as is. So I paint into the ends of each protruding piece of cord with raw umber and then black, to make it look as weathered and shaded as the rest of the armour. I also paint a little black into the areas where the straps meet the armour just to shade them a little. And with that, my impromptu leather pauldron is complete. Well, I hope that you enjoyed watching this video just as much as I enjoyed working on this little impromptu build. If you did, please leave a like and a comment down below, and if you'd like to see more cosplay and crafting tutorials and video content, then remember to subscribe to my channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.